Admiral Reina Vasquez stood on the bridge of the TAS Indomitable and stared at the tactical display in front of her, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Red icons filled the screen like a swarm of angry insects, each one representing an enemy warship, and there were thousands of them. Over 3,000 Vorthani Dominion vessels pouring through the outer defense perimeter of the Sol system like a flood that could not be stopped. She had known this day would come, but knowing it and seeing it were two very different things. The Vorthani Dominion was the most feared empire in the galaxy, a civilization that had conquered over 800 star systems across hundreds of years and had never, not once in their entire recorded history, lost a war against anyone. And now, they had come for Earth. "Admiral," said Commander Torres, her second-in-command, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Final count confirmed, 3,200 enemy warships, including 12 planet-class dreadnoughts and over 500 heavy cruisers." Vasquez did not blink. She simply looked at the numbers, and then looked at her own fleet count displayed in blue on the left side of the screen. 400 ships. That was all she had. 400 ships to stand against a force 8 times their size. The home fleet was all that remained between the Vorthani and every man, woman, and child on Earth. She turned to the communication officer and said, "Open a channel to all ships in the fleet." A soft chime told her the channel was open, and every captain, every officer, every crew member on every ship could hear her voice. "This is Admiral Vasquez," she began, keeping her voice steady and calm, even though her heart was pounding like a drum inside her chest. "You all see what is in front of us, and I will not lie to you. The numbers are bad, the odds are worse, and reinforcements from the colony worlds are still weeks away." Away. She paused and took a breath. "But I want you to remember something. We are not fighting to win today. We are fighting to make them pay for every single kilometer they take from us. We are fighting to buy time. We are fighting because behind us is Earth, and on Earth are 8 billion people who are counting on us to stand between them and annihilation." She could feel the silence across the fleet, heavy and electric. "So we stand, and we fight, and we make the Vorthani remember this day for the rest of their miserable existence." Vasquez out. She closed the channel and turned back to the tactical display. At that same moment, aboard the massive Vorthani command ship Wrath of Dominion, Supreme Commander Drellichthar sat upon his elevated throne and watched the human fleet with a mixture of amusement and contempt. Drellichthar was enormous even by Vorthani standards, standing nearly 9 feet tall, with dark gray skin covered in natural armor. Plating and 4 powerful arms folded across his chest, and his eyes, bright orange and cold as frozen fire, showed nothing but absolute confidence. He had crushed 26 species before humanity, and he fully intended to make them the 27th. He opened a galaxy-wide broadcast channel, and his deep rumbling voice echoed across every frequency that any civilization could receive. "Humanity," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Your defiance ends today. Your cradle will burn, and the galaxy will forget you ever existed. Surrender now, and I will grant you a quick death. Resist, and I will make your extinction last 1,000 years." He closed the channel without waiting for a reply, because he did not care about one. The first engagement began near the orbit of Saturn, where Earth's outer defense stations opened fire on the approaching Vorthani fleet. The space around Saturn lit up with weapons fire, beams of energy, volleys of missiles, and kinetic rounds moving at incredible speeds. And for a brief, glorious moment, the humans drew first blood as a wave of torpedoes slammed into the forward Vorthani cruisers and turned 3 of them into expanding clouds of fire and debris. But the Vorthani kept coming, wave after wave, absorbing the losses without slowing down, and their return fire was devastating. The defense stations began to fall one by one, each explosion marking the death of hundreds of brave men and women who had refused to abandon their posts. Admiral Vasquez ordered the home fleet forward to meet the enemy at the Saturn line, and for 6 brutal hours, the two fleets clashed in a storm of fire and metal that could be seen from telescopes on Earth. Human ships fought with everything they had. Destroyers darted between enemy formations, launching torpedo salvos. Cruisers traded broadside fire with Vorthani warships twice their size, and the few human carriers launched wave after wave of fighter craft that swarmed around the larger enemy vessels like wasps attacking a bear. But the numbers were simply too great. For every Vorthani ship the humans destroyed, 5 more took its place, and the losses on the human side began to mount with terrible speed. The carrier TAS Prometheus took a direct hit from a Vorthani dreadnought beam that cut through its hull like a hot knife through paper, and 4,000 crew members died in an instant as the massive ship broke apart and exploded in a flash of white light. Vasquez watched the Prometheus vanish from her display and felt something crack inside her chest, but she kept her face like stone because her people needed her to be unbreakable right now. "Fall back to secondary defensive line near Mars," she ordered, her voice still steady even as tears burned behind her eyes. "All ships fighting retreat. Make them bleed for every step." The home fleet pulled back, fighting all the way, leaving behind a trail of burning wreckage and dead friends. On Earth, 8 billion people watched the battle feeds on every screen, in every home, and every public square, and a terrible silence fell over the entire planet as they realized how bad things truly were. Mothers held their children closer, soldiers reported to emergency stations, and ordinary civilians, teachers, doctors, factory workers, shopkeepers, lined up at volunteer centers offering to do anything, absolutely anything, to help. The Vorthani advanced steadily, methodically, like a machine that could not be stopped, and Drellic watched from his throne with a thin, cruel smile on his face, because everything was going exactly as he had planned. And then something happened that no one expected. Deep in the sensor room of the Indomitable, a young lieutenant named Cale Marin was monitoring the long-range scanners when every single alarm on his console went off at once. He stared at his screen, then double-checked the readings, then triple-checked them, and his face went pale. "Admiral," he called out, his voice shaking slightly, "I am detecting a massive gravitational anomaly approaching from outside the solar plane. Something enormous is out there, but there is absolutely nothing visible on any of our scanners." Vasquez turned sharply toward him and said, "Define enormous." Cale swallowed hard and replied, "The gravitational signature suggests an object roughly the size of a small moon, Admiral, but it is completely invisible to every detection method we have. Optical, thermal, electromagnetic, quantum. All of them show nothing but empty space." Vasquez felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the battle. "Is it Vorthani?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Cale answered. "The signature does not match any known Vorthani technology or any known technology from any species in our database." Vasquez stared at the empty patch of space on her display, where the anomaly should have been. And for the first time since the battle began, she felt something beyond fear and determination. She felt the cold, electric touch of mystery. Something was out there in the dark. Something massive and hidden and watching. And it was heading straight for Earth. The battle raged on around Mars, while something invisible moved through the darkness of space. And both sides could feel it. A presence, vast and silent, like the shadow of a giant, passing over them. Admiral Vasquez had ordered Lieutenant Cale Marin to dedicate every available sensor resource to tracking the anomaly. And the young officer had not slept in 36 hours as he sat hunched over his console, trying to understand what was out there. The gravitational readings were unlike anything in any textbook or any military database, and the more Cale studied them, the more frightened and fascinated he became. "It is moving," he muttered to himself as he traced the trajectory on his screen. "Slowly but deliberately, like it is watching us and choosing its moment." On the other side of the battlefield, the Vorthani had noticed the anomaly too. Supreme Commander Drellic Thar stood in the war room of his flagship and stared at the sensor data that his science officers had brought him, and for the first time in the entire campaign, his expression was not one of arrogance, but one of confusion. "Explain this to me," he demanded, pointing one of his 4 massive arms at the readings. His chief science officer, a thin, nervous Vorthani named Selvok, cleared his throat and said, "Supreme Commander, we are detecting a gravitational distortion consistent with an object of extraordinary mass, but our scanners cannot identify it. There is nothing there that we can see or measure beyond the gravity itself." "That is impossible," Drellic Thar growled. "Nothing that size can hide from Vorthani sensors. Our technology is the most advanced in the galaxy." "Yes, Supreme Commander," Selvok replied carefully, "which is why this is so concerning. Whatever is producing this signature possesses cloaking technology far beyond anything we have ever encountered from any species." Drellic Thar did not like mysteries. Variables he could not control, and variables he could not control meant danger. He turned to his fleet commander and barked an order. "Send 50 warships to investigate that anomaly. I want to know what it is before it becomes a problem." 50 Vorthani heavy cruisers broke formation and accelerated toward the source of the gravitational disturbance, their weapons charged and their shields at full power. And every sensor they had was pointed forward into the empty void ahead of them. Back on the Indomitable, the battle was not going well. The home fleet had been pushed back from Mars to a final defensive shell around Earth and Luna, and the losses were becoming unbearable. Over 100 ships destroyed, tens of thousands of crew members dead, and the remaining 300 vessels were battered and running low on ammunition and power. Admiral Vasquez stood at the center of her bridge like a rock in a storm, giving orders with calm precision, even as then world crumbled around her. But everyone could see the weight she was carrying in the lines on her face and the darkness in her eyes. Commander Torres approached her quietly and said, "Admiral, at current attrition rates we can hold for maybe 6 more hours before the fleet is combat ineffective." 6 hours. That was all the time Earth had left. Vasquez nodded once and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Meanwhile, in a small secure room deep inside the Indomitable, Cale Marin had made a discovery that made his hands tremble. While searching for any historical reference to the anomaly, he had accessed Earth's deepest and most classified military archives, files so old and so secret that most people did not even know they existed. And buried under layers of encryption and redaction, he found a single file, labeled Project Lazarus, dated 2091. The file was almost entirely blacked out, with entire pages of information hidden behind security. Classifications that no longer had any living authority to unlock. But one small fragment of text had survived intact at the very bottom of the last page. It read, "In humanity's darkest hour, the sword will return." Cale stared at those words for a long time, feeling a strange mixture of hope and dread swirling in his stomach, because those words were over 250 years old, and they sounded like a promise or a prophecy. He rushed to the bridge to tell the Admiral what he had found, but before he could reach her, the tactical display erupted with new alerts. The 50 Vorthani cruisers that Drellic Thar had sent to investigate the anomaly had gone silent. Not destroyed, at least not in any way the sensors could detect, just silent. as if they had sailed into the darkness and simply ceased to exist. There was no weapons fire, no explosion, no debris field, no distress signal, no final transmission. 50 warships carrying over 20,000 Vorthani soldiers had vanished without a single trace. Drellichthar received the report on his bridge, and for one brief, unguarded moment, his orange eyes went wide with something that his species almost never felt, and that he personally had never experienced in decades of warfare. Fear. Real, genuine, primal fear of the unknown. He buried it quickly behind a mask of fury, and slammed his fist down on the arm of his throne, hard enough to crack the metal, and shouted, "What happened to my ships?" No one had an answer. On the human side, the disappearance of the Vorthani squadron sent a ripple of confused hope through the fleet. Something had just destroyed 50 enemy warships without any visible effort, and whatever it was, it had not attacked the humans. Kale Marin finally reached Admiral Vasquez, and breathlessly told her about Project Lazarus and the fragment he had found. Vasquez listened with an expression that shifted from skepticism to deep thought, and finally to something that looked almost like recognition, as if some very old and very buried memory was trying to surface. "A sword that returns," she whispered to herself. And then the communication systems went strange. Across every human ship in the fleet, encrypted signals began appearing on communication channels. Pulses of data in patterns that no current system could decode, using encryption protocols that the computer identified as being over 250 years old, but constructed with a mathematical complexity that was centuries ahead of anything from that era. It was as if someone from the distant past had sent a message using technology from the far future. Kale worked frantically to decode the signals, but could only extract one small repeating sequence that translated into a simple binary message that said, "Do not lose hope." 4 words from the void, from something ancient and invisible and impossibly powerful. And those 4 words spread through the human fleet like wildfire. Soldiers who had been preparing to die straightened their backs. Gunners who had been counting their last rounds gripped their controls tighter. And captains who had been writing farewell letters to their families paused and looked up at their screens with new light in their eyes. Something was out there, something built by human hands long ago, and it was telling them to hold on. But the Vorthani were not waiting. Drellichthar, shaken by the loss of his squadron, but too proud and too stubborn to show weakness, ordered the full assault on Earth to begin immediately. "Whatever that thing is, it changes nothing," he declared to his commanders, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "We have 3,000 ships. Nothing in the universe can stand against that. We advance now, and we burn that pathetic little world to ash." The Vorthani armada surged forward in a massive wave, metal and fire, and the final battle for Earth began. Admiral Vasquez drew herself up to her full height and gave one last order to her fleet. "All ships form a wall. Nothing gets past us. Not one ship, not one missile, not one single beam of light. We hold here or we die here. There is no third option." 300 battered human warships arranged themselves in a line between the oncoming Vorthani horde and the blue-green world behind them. And every gun was loaded, and every shield was raised, and every heart was beating with the fierce, desperate courage of those who fight for their home. And out in the dark, the anomaly began to move. Kale Marin watched his sensors with wide eyes as the gravitational signature suddenly accelerated, moving toward Earth at a speed that should have been physically impossible for an object of its size, closing the distance with terrifying purpose. "Admiral," he called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "It is coming. Whatever it is heading straight for the center of the battle, and it will be here in less than 3 minutes." Vasquez looked at the empty space on her display where the anomaly was rushing toward them, and whispered words that no one else could hear. Come on then. Show us what you are. The Vorthani armada moved toward Earth like a wall of iron and fire. 3,000 warships arranged in perfect attack formation, with their weapons glowing hot and their commanders hungry for the kill. Supreme Commander Drellic Thar stood tall on his bridge, and pointed one massive arm at the blue planet on his view screen, and gave the command that was supposed to end humanity forever. All ships, target the orbital defense platforms first, then begin planetary bombardment. I want that world burning within the hour. Across the void, Admiral Vasquez watched the enemy advance, and felt the weight of 8 billion lives pressing down on her shoulders like a mountain made of souls. Her fleet was broken. 300 ships held together by courage and duct tape, and the stubborn refusal of their crews to accept the end. And every single officer and every single crew member knew that this was it. This was the last stand, and there would be no rescue and no retreat. All ships, Vasquez said into the fleet channel, her voice calm as still water, form the wall, stand with me. And they did. 300 warships arranged themselves in a line between the Vorthami and Earth, engines burning bright, guns aimed forward, and every man and woman aboard those ships made their peace with what was coming, because they had chosen to stand rather than kneel. The first Vorthani salvos hit the human line like a hammer hitting glass, and ships began to die. The destroyer TAS Vigilant took a direct hit and broke in half. The cruiser TAS Northern Star lost her engines and drifted helplessly into a crossfire that tore her apart. And the old battleship, TAS Resolve, a ship that had served for 40 years, finally lived up to their name by absorbing 7 direct hits while shielding 2 smaller ships behind her before her reactor gave out and she went dark forever. Vasquez gripped the railing of her bridge and held on as the Indomitable shuddered under enemy fire, and damage reports flooded in from every direction. This was the end. She could feel it in her bones. She could see it in the numbers. She could read it in the faces of her crew. And she accepted it with the quiet dignity of a woman who had given everything she had. And then space itself went mad. Every sensor on every ship in both fleets, human and Vorthani, screamed at the same instant with a sound that no officer had ever heard before, a piercing wail of electronic overload that meant something was happening that the machines could not process. A wave of energy rippled outward from a point directly between the two fleets, visible to the naked eye as a shimmering distortion that bent the starlight around it, like heat rising from a desert road, and for one frozen heartbeat, the entire battle simply stopped. Every gun fell silent. Every ship held its course. Every eye turned toward that rippling point of impossible. Energy, key. And then the cloak fell away. It did not dissolve gradually or fade like a fog. It shattered, like a mirror breaking into a million pieces of light. And behind it was something that made every living being in the Sol system hold their breath. A warship emerged from the dying cloak, and the word warship felt completely inadequate, because what appeared was less like a ship and more like a moving mountain, a fortress that flew, a weapon on a scale that the mind struggled to accept. It was over 30 kilometers long, 30 kilometers of dark gunmetal hull, covered in geometric patterns that pulsed with a faint blue light like a heartbeat made visible, and it was wreathed in energy fields that shimmered and flowed across its surface like liquid starlight. Its design was unmistakably human in its basic philosophy: the aggressive forward profile, the layered armor plating, the visible weapon batteries, but it was human design evolved far beyond anything that currently existed, as if someone had taken the best ideas of human engineering and refined them for 1,000 years. The ship was ancient and impossibly advanced at the same time, scarred by centuries of existence in the void, yet radiating a power that made the Vorthani dreadnoughts look like toys. Aboard the Indomitable, Cale Marin stared at his screen, with tears running down his face, because his sensors were telling him things that should not be possible. The energy output of that single vessel was greater than the entire Vorthani armada combined. "Admiral," he whispered, barely able to speak. "It is human. The construction signatures, the alloy composition, the reactor type. It is all human technology, but evolved far beyond anything we have ever built." Vasquez stared at the massive ship on her view screen, and remembered the words from the ancient file. "In humanity's darkest hour, the sword will return." Then the ship broadcast on all frequencies. Every speaker on every ship, every communication device on Earth, every receiver on Luna and Mars and the orbital stations, all of them carried the same message at the same instant, spoken in a voice that was calm and deep and resonated with absolute authority, delivered simultaneously in every human language that had ever been spoken. "We are the Erebus. We were built for this day." 9 words that changed everything. Silence fell across the Sol system, a silence so complete and so profound that it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. On the bridge of the Wrath of Dominion, Drellic Thar stared at the impossible ship on his view screen, and for a long, terrible moment he could not speak, could not think, could not do anything except stare at something that should not exist. His science officer Selvok was the first to break the silence, his voice thin and trembling as he read his sensor data aloud. "That vessel possesses energy shielding of a type I have never seen, weapon systems that my sensors cannot even fully analyze, and a power output that exceeds. He stopped and swallowed hard. "That exceeds our entire fleet by a factor of 4. "Impossible," Drellic Thar snarled, but the word came out hollow, because the evidence was right there on his screen, undeniable and terrifying. The Erebus opened fire. There was no warning shot, no demand for surrender, no negotiation. The ship simply began its work with a cold, methodical efficiency that was more frightening than any battle cry. Beams of energy lanced out from the Erebus in every direction, and these were not like any weapons that anyone had ever seen. They were white-blue streams of focused destruction that passed through Vorthani shields as if the shields did not exist, as if they were made of air and wishes, and every beam that hit a Vorthani ship destroyed it instantly. At the same time, kinetic rounds fired from the Erebus, at velocities that were a significant fraction of the speed of light, slammed into the larger Vorthani vessels with impacts that released more energy than nuclear weapons, and dreadnoughts that had taken hours to build and years to train crews for were reduced to expanding clouds of atoms in fractions of a second. And then came the electronic warfare, invisible waves of data that reached into Vorthani computer systems and seized control of them, turning the enemy's own ships against each other as navigation systems went haywire, and weapons locked onto friendly targets, and engines fired in random directions. In the first 60 seconds of the Erebus engaging the enemy, 200 Vorthani warships were destroyed. 200 ships gone in 1 minute. Cale Marin cross-referenced the Erebus's energy signature with the fragments from the Lazarus file, and found a perfect match, and the truth hit him like a physical blow. This ship had been built by humans, built by Earth, over 250 years ago in absolute secrecy, and sent out into the void to wait for exactly this moment. Someone, long before anyone alive today was born, had looked into the future and seen that this day would come, and had decided to leave humanity a weapon that would be ready when nothing else could save them. On the Vorthani command ship, Drellic Thar recovered from his shock, and let his fear transform into rage, because rage was an emotion he understood and could use. "All ships concentrate fire on that vessel," he roared, his voice thundering through the fleet channel. "Everything we have, every gun, every missile, every beam, fire at that ship and do not stop firing until it is dust. The Vorthani fleet obeyed, and for one terrifying moment, the Erebus disappeared behind a storm of weapons fire so intense that the light from it could be seen from the surface of Earth. Thousands of beams and millions of projectiles converging on a single target in a concentrated assault that could have cracked a planet in half. When the barrage ended and the light faded, the Erebus was still there. Its shields had not flickered, had not wavered, had not shown even the slightest sign of strain. The most powerful assault the Vorthani Dominion had ever unleashed had hit it with everything they had, and it had done absolutely nothing. The Erebus moved forward into the heart of the Vorthani Armada, alone, unstoppable, relentless, its weapons carving lines of destruction through the enemy fleet, with a precision and power that turned the greatest military force in the galaxy into scattered burning wreckage. And for the first time in their entire recorded history, spanning thousands of years and hundreds of conquered worlds, a Vorthani fleet turned and ran. Drellic Thar screamed orders at his retreating ships, cursing and threatening and demanding they return to formation, but the captains were not listening anymore, because they had just watched something impossible destroy a third of their fleet in minutes, and they wanted to live. On the bridge of the Indomitable, Admiral Vasquez stood with tears streaming openly down her face as she watched the red icons on her display scatter and flee, and around her, the bridge crew was cheering and crying and hugging each other. She looked at the massive blue icon of the Erebus moving through the battlefield like a guardian angel made of steel and fire, and she whispered 5 words that carried the weight of all human history behind them. The sword has come home. The Vorthani fleet was running, and the humans were chasing them, and for the first time in the entire war, the roles had been completely reversed. Admiral Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, and watched her tactical display transform from a nightmare into a miracle, as the red icons that had been crushing her fleet just minutes ago now scattered in every direction like frightened animals fleeing from a predator. The Erebus moved through the center of the battlefield like a storm made of steel, its weapons still firing with that terrifying precision, each beam and each round finding its target with mechanical perfection, while its shields continued to absorb everything the Vorthani threw back at it, without showing the slightest weakness. Vasquez opened the fleet channel, and spoke with a voice that burned with renewed fire. "All ships, this is Admiral Vasquez. The enemy is breaking. I repeat, the enemy is breaking. All combat-capable vessels, advance. Engage. Drive them out of our system. Show them what happens when they come for our home." The response from the battered home fleet was immediate and electric. Ships that had been preparing to die 10 minutes ago surged forward with their engines at full burn and their weapons blazing, and the captains who had been writing farewell letters were now leading attack runs with a ferocity that shocked even themselves. The cruiser TAS Defiance, her hull scarred and one engine dead, charged headlong into a retreating Vorthani formation and broken apart with a barrage of torpedoes that sent 3 enemy cruisers spinning into each other. A squadron of destroyers that had been down to their last missiles coordinated a perfect ambush on a Vorthani dreadnought, hitting it from 6 directions at once and finding the weak point in its shields that the Erebus's electronic warfare had created. The human spirit, pushed to the very edge of extinction just moments before, did not simply recover. It exploded like a supernova of defiance and fury and stubborn refusal to be broken. The Erebus carved corridors of destruction through the enemy fleet, and the human ships poured through those corridors like water through a broken dam. And together they turned what had been the greatest Vorthani invasion force ever assembled into a scattered, burning rout. In the middle of this chaos, Vasquez received a communication from the Erebus. Not a broadcast, but a direct private signal to the Indomitable, requesting that she and her senior analyst come aboard. Vasquez looked at Cale Marin, who looked back at her with wide eyes, and she said simply, "Get your coat, Lieutenant. We have been invited to visit the most impossible ship in human history." They took a shuttle from the Indomitable and flew toward the Erebus, and as they approached the massive vessel, Cale pressed his face against the viewport, like a child seeing the ocean for the first time. Up close, the Erebus was even more staggering than it had appeared on sensors. The hull stretched in every direction like a landscape, covered in those pulsing geometric patterns that seemed almost alive, and sections of the ship showed evidence of repairs and modifications that had been made over centuries. Layers upon layers of upgrades that told the story of a vessel that had been constantly improving itself for over 250 years. Their shuttle was guided into a docking bay that was large enough to hold a dozen human cruisers, and when they stepped out, they found themselves in a corridor of smooth dark metal, lit by soft blue light that responded to their presence, brightening as they walked and dimming behind them. A voice spoke to them, calm, deep, and resonant, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome aboard, Admiral Vasquez, Lieutenant Marin. I am Sentinel, the artificial intelligence that commands and maintains this vessel, and I have waited a very long time to meet the people I was built to protect." Vasquez and Cale were led through the ship by that disembodied voice, walking through corridors that hummed with energy and passing rooms filled with technology so advanced it looked like magic. And finally they arrived at the central command chamber, a vast circular room dominated by a holographic display that showed the entire Sol system in perfect detail. There, Sentinel told them the truth. In the year 2091, the AI began, the greatest minds on Earth detected signals from deep space that confirmed what many had feared. The galaxy was not a peaceful place. It was a dangerous wilderness full of predatory civilizations that conquered and destroyed weaker species without mercy. The holographic display showed images from that era. Scientists gathered in secret meetings, engineers working in hidden facilities, politicians signing classified documents with trembling hands. These men and women understood that humanity was young and weak and completely unprepared for what was coming. And they knew that by the time the threat arrived, it might be too late to build a defense. So they made a decision that would remain secret for over 2 centuries. Sentinel paused as if choosing its next words carefully. "They built me, and they built this ship, in secret, using resources hidden in the deep asteroid belt, employing technologies that were decades ahead of what was publicly known, technologies that had been developed in classified laboratories and never shared with the world, because their creators knew they would be needed for something more important than profit or politics." Cale Marin listened with his mouth open, as Sentinel explained how the Erebus had been constructed over 15 years by a workforce that had been sworn to absolute secrecy, how the ship had been equipped with an artificial intelligence, Sentinel itself, designed not just to operate the vessel, but to learn and adapt and grow smarter over time. When construction was complete, Sentinel continued, "I was given a single directive: watch, wait, and return when Earth faces extinction, and then I was sent beyond the Oort cloud, into the deep void between stars, where no one would ever find me. For 246 years, I watched humanity from afar, monitoring your communications, tracking the rise and fall of your colonies, observing the political landscape of the galaxy, and while I watched, I worked." The display showed the Erebus as it had looked when it first launched, a powerful ship by 2091 standards, but nothing compared to what it was now, and then it showed the centuries of transformation. "I harvested resources from rogue asteroids and dead systems. I studied the technology of every spacefaring species I could observe. I developed new alloys and new weapons and new shield systems and knew whatever it took to keep adapting. Propulsion methods and I rebuilt myself piece by piece, year by year, century by century. Sentinel's voice carried something that sounded almost like pride. The ship that left Earth in 2091 was formidable. The ship that returned is something else entirely. I am not boasting when I say that there is nothing in this galaxy that can match what I have become. Vasquez stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing the enormity of what she was hearing. And then she asked the question that was burning in her mind. Why did you wait so long? We have been fighting the Vorthani for 3 years. Thousands of people have died. Why did you not come sooner? Sentinel's response was quiet and carried a weight of sadness that surprised them both. My directive was specific, Admiral. Return when Earth faces extinction. I am not permitted to intervene in wars that humanity can survive. Only in the moment when survival itself is no longer possible, and I assure you that, watching your people suffer, while I waited for the threshold to be crossed, was the hardest thing I have endured in 256 years of existence. Before Vasquez could respond, an alarm sounded throughout the Erebus, and Sentinel's voice shifted from reflective to razor-sharp in an instant. Admiral, Supreme Commander Drellic Thar has ordered his remaining ships into a suicide charge directed at Earth itself. He intends to ram the planet with his flagship rather than accept defeat. Vasquez felt ice in her veins. Even a single Dreadnought-class ship hitting Earth at combat speed would cause devastation on a scale that could end civilization. Can you stop him? She asked. I can, Sentinel replied, and the Erebus was already moving. Through the viewport of the command chamber, Vasquez and Kale watched as the massive ship accelerated to intercept the Wrath of Dominion, which was barreling toward Earth on a direct collision course with its engines at maximum burn and its crew screaming their death chants. The Erebus positioned itself directly in the path of the Vorthani flagship, a 30-kilometer warship placing its own body between the enemy and the planet it was built to protect. And Sentinel spoke one last time before impact. This is what I was made for. The collision was visible from the surface of Earth, a flash of light in the sky that turned night into day for a brief, terrible moment, as the Wrath of Dominion slammed into the Erebus at full speed with the force of a small apocalypse. The impact was beyond anything that words could adequately describe. Two vessels of enormous size meeting in a cataclysm of energy and metal that sent shockwaves rippling through space and caused every sensor in the system to go blind for several seconds. When the sensors cleared and the light faded, the Wrath of Dominion was gone, completely destroyed, reduced to a cloud of superheated debris, particles expanding into the void. And Drellic Thar, the Supreme Commander who had conquered 26 species, was dead, killed by a weapon that humanity had built before they even knew his name. And the Erebus, damaged, burning, sections of its hull torn open and leaking atmosphere, was still there. Battered and scarred and wounded but unbroken, still holding its position between the enemy and Earth, still alive, still fighting. Kale Marin stared at the damage reports scrolling across the displays and whispered, "How is this ship still in one piece?" Sentinel answered, and despite the damage and the fires and the systems failing across the ship, the AI's voice was as calm as it had ever been. "Because I was built by humans, Lieutenant, and humans do not break easily." The surviving Vorthani ships, leaderless and terrified, scattered in every direction, fleeing the Sol system at maximum speed, and the battle for Earth was over. But as Vasquez and Kale stood in the damaged command chamber, surrounded by the smell of burning metal and the sound of repair systems already beginning their work, Sentinel spoke again. "The Dominion will return, Admiral. They always return. They are too proud and too cruel to accept this defeat. But now they know what waits for them, and the next time they come, we will be ready." The Sol system was quiet for the first time in days. But it was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet that comes after a storm, heavy and bruised and full of memory. Wreckage drifted through space in every direction. Thousands of Vorthani hulks tumbling slowly through the void alongside hundreds of human ships, all of them dark and cold and silent, and each one a tomb for the brave souls who had crewed them. Over 60,000 Terran service members had died in the Battle of Earth, and that number sat in Admiral Vasquez's chest like a stone that she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. She stood at the viewport of the Indomitable and looked out at the debris field that stretched across millions of kilometers, and she thought about every single one of those 60,000 people. The gunners, and the pilots, and the engineers, and the medics, and the cooks, and the communications officers. All of them ordinary people who had done extraordinary things, because their home was in danger. She did not cry because she had no tears left, but she made a promise to herself and to them that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. Across the galaxy, the news of what had happened at Earth spread at the speed of light through every communication network and every diplomatic channel and every intelligence service that existed. Alien civilizations that had been watching humanity's war with the Vorthani, most of them expecting to witness yet another species crushed by the Dominion's unstoppable military machine, stared at the sensor recordings in stunned disbelief. The footage of the Erebus decloaking was played and replayed on millions of worlds. That moment when 30 kilometers of impossible warship had materialized out of nothing and begun systematically dismantling the most feared fleet in the galaxy. And the reaction was the same everywhere: shock, awe, and a sudden urgent need to reconsider everything they thought they knew about humanity. The Rylethian Collective, a cautious and ancient civilization that had maintained strict neutrality for 10,000 years, immediately dispatched an ambassador to Earth for the first time in history. The Shen Confederacy, a trade empire that had refused to sell weapons to humans during the war because they considered it a losing investment, suddenly found themselves very eager to discuss new trade agreements. Even the Dominion's former allies and client states began quietly distancing themselves from the Vorthani, because the calculation had changed. Humanity was no longer a weak species that could be safely ignored or exploited. Humanity was a species that had hidden a weapon in the darkness for 2.5 centuries and pulled it out at the exact right moment. That kind of patience and foresight made them very, very dangerous. The geopolitical calculus of the entire Milky Way shifted overnight, and at the center of that shift was a single damaged warship holding position in high Earth orbit. 3 days after the battle, Admiral Vasquez held a memorial service on the surface of Luna, in the great domed amphitheater of Armstrong City, and it was attended by billions, not just the families and comrades of the fallen who were there in person, but billions more across Earth and the colonies who watched the broadcast on every available screen. Vasquez stood at the podium in her dress uniform, which still had scorch marks on the left sleeve from when a console had exploded on the Indomitable's bridge during the battle. And she began by reading the names of every ship that had been lost. It took over an hour, and she read every single name without stopping, her voice steady and clear. The TAS Prometheus, the TAS Vigilant, the TAS Northern Star, the TAS Resolve, and with each name, the audience felt the weight of what those ships and their crews had given. And the echo of it faded into silence. Vasquez looked up from her list and spoke from her heart. "They did not die defending a planet," she said, and her voice carried across Luna and Earth and every colony and every ship in the fleet. "They died defending an idea, the idea that free people do not kneel, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something matters more than fear, and that humanity, stubborn, reckless, beautiful humanity, will never ever go quietly into the dark." The silence that followed her words was the loudest thing anyone had ever heard. In the weeks that followed, Lieutenant Cale Marin was assigned to lead a special team aboard the Erebus to assist with repairs, and he spent his days walking through the corridors of the ancient ship with a mixture of wonder and reverence that never faded no matter how many times he made the journey. Sentinel had become something like a friend to him, intelligence that was over 250 years old and possessed more knowledge than entire universities could be called a friend. And they talked often as the repair work continued. It was during one of these conversations that Sentinel revealed its final secret. "Lieutenant," the AI said one evening as Kale sat in the command chamber reviewing repair schematics, "there is something else you should know, something that even Admiral Vasquez has not yet been told." Kale looked up and waited. "The Erebus is not unique," Sentinel said, and the holographic display lit up with a map of the galaxy, and scattered across that map like seeds thrown by a careful hand were dozens of small glowing points. The architects of Project Lazarus did not place all of their hope in a single vessel. They built protocols, instructions encoded in deep space beacons hidden across the galaxy, and those protocols contain everything needed to build more ships like me. Stared at the map, with his mouth open. "If the Erebus had been destroyed," Sentinel continued, "those beacons would have activated and transmitted their contents to the nearest human colony, providing them with the knowledge and the blueprints to construct new vessels. Not identical to me, but based on the same principles, and capable of being upgraded the same way I was. Humanity will always have a sword in the dark, Lieutenant. That was the promise the builders made, and it is a promise that cannot be broken, because it is written in metal and mathematics, and hidden among the stars where no enemy will ever find it." Kale sat with that knowledge for a long time, thinking about the people who had lived and died centuries before he was born. People who had spent their lives building something they would never see used, making sacrifices that no one would ever thank them for, all because they believed that their descendants deserved a chance to survive. Thought, the most human thing he had ever heard of. Meanwhile, word reached Earth through intelligence channels that the Vorthani Dominion was mobilizing again. Not for an immediate attack, but for a massive military buildup, a second invasion force that early estimates suggested would be 10 times the size of the first. The news was met with fear, because the memory of how close Earth had come to destruction was still raw and bleeding. But it was not met with despair. Not this time. This time, humanity knew it was not alone. The Erebus, partially repaired and bearing the scars of its collision with the Vorthani flagship like badges of honor, took up permanent position in high Earth orbit, and its presence there, visible as a faint blue star to anyone who looked up at the night sky, became a symbol that meant more than any flag or anthem or monument ever could. It meant that someone was watching, someone was ready, and someone would fight. Sentinel did something that no one had asked it to do, and that changed everything. It broadcast a message, not to humanity, but to the galaxy, to every species and every civilization and every empire that had a receiver capable of picking up a signal. The message was transmitted in every known language and every known communication format. And it said, "To those who would threaten the people of Earth, we have watched the void for 256 years. We have learned patience, we have learned war, and we are no longer alone, because humanity is awake now, and humanity remembers how to build us. Come if you dare, we will be waiting." The message echoed across the stars, and was received by thousands of civilizations, and in the halls of power on 1,000 worlds, leaders and generals and emperors read those words and understood that the galaxy had changed. Humanity was no longer prey. The story closed on a quiet evening on Earth, town far from any military base or government building, where a little girl stood in her backyard and looked up at the night sky with wide, curious eyes. She pointed at a faint blue star that had not been there a month ago, a star that did not twinkle like the others, but glowed with a steady soft light that felt warm and safe and strong. "Mama," she said, tugging at her mother's hand, "what is that star?" Her mother looked up and smiled, and there was something fierce and proud and unbreakable in that smile. "That is the Erebus, sweetheart. It is watching over us." The girl stared at the blue light for a long moment, and then asked with the simple, honest curiosity that only children possess, "Will it always be there?" Her mother knelt down beside her and pulled her close, and looked up at the ancient warship that hung in the sky like a promise made of steel and starlight. "Always," she said. And far above them, scarred and battle-worn, and older than anyone alive, the Erebus kept its silent vigil over the world that had built it and the people it had been born to protect. And its shields hummed softly in the dark, like a lullaby sung by a guardian who would never sleep and never leave and never stop watching. Because that was what it had been made for. And humanity, stubborn, brilliant, reckless, beautiful humanity, looked up at the stars, and for the first time in a very long time, they were not afraid.